Today, from Philip DeCourcy on Know the Truth.
It's amazing what the body can do and what it can endure if it's taken care of. And that's a biblical principle. After all, if you think about it, what does Paul tell us in his letter to the Corinthians? Your body is not your own. Therefore, if we understand that, our bodies must reflect God's ownership of them. We must be good stewards of this body which is fearfully and wonderfully made.
If we're being honest, most of us can admit to feeling discouraged or even depressed at times. But when we're down in the dumps, how do we recover from these moments and move into a healthier place? That's our topic today on Know the Truth. Philip DeCourcy is continuing to study on the prophet Elijah and how he struggled through a low point in his ministry. Perhaps you could use some encouragement today. If so, here's Philip DeCourcy with his message titled, Down But Not Out.
For several weeks now, we've been down in the dumps with Elijah. And I think many of us were taken by surprise to find such a spiritual giant collapsed in a heap under the broom tree, deep in depression. Depression in such a man. Depression at such a moment. Depression over such a matter. And as we pulled our seat up beside Elijah, we discovered that there were 5 factors that contributed to his discouragement. We saw that he was frustrated. He had allowed disappointment to take his eyes off God, just like Peter took his eyes off Jesus Christ in looking at the wind and the waves. And just as with Peter, Elijah had this sinking feeling when he got his eyes off God through disappointment and frustration. He was not only frustrated, he was faithless. Elijah took counsel from his fears. Elijah took counsel from his feelings, and they ran in a state of panic. Every other time Elijah had taken a journey, God had commanded him to do so. The word of the Lord came to Elijah on a number of occasions, but not this time, because you see, Elijah had lost his center. Elijah had lost his focus on God. He's frustrated. He's faithless. He's fatigued. This guy is exhausted. He has very little reserves to fight disappointment and discouragement. He has very little tolerance for extra pressure at this point in his life. And so that added into the mix brings him to a very low point in his life and in his ministry. He's frustrated, he's faithless, he's fatigued, he's forlorn, he's by himself. He made a critical mistake when he left his servant behind and went further into the wilderness. He cut himself off from the oxygen of mutual encouragement found between one person and another. And then it's no wonder we find him forgetful. He's lost perspective, he's lost passion. We have indeed underscored the causes of Elijah's depression. But I want to take up the cure. We've looked at his disappearance, we've looked at his despondence, and now I want to consider with you his deliverance, because God graciously and gently nurses Elijah back to physical, emotional, and spiritual health. God doesn't treat his servant coldly or callously. God treats him compassionately. Elijah received much more compassion from God than the patient who called the psychiatric hotline and discovered this message. If you are obsessive compulsive, please press 1 repeatedly. If you are a codependent, please ask someone else to press 2. If you have multiple personalities, please press 3, 4, 5, and 6. If you are paranoid, delusional, we know who you are and what you want. Just stay on the line and we'll trace the call. If you're schizophrenic, listen carefully and a little voice will tell you which number to press. And if you're manic depressive, it doesn't matter which number you press, no one will answer. What are depressed people to do? What are the discouraged people to do? Well, let's see God's treatment of Elijah, his deliverance from depression and discouragement. And the first thing I just want you to notice, I've kind of already stated, is that God treats him gently and graciously. In fact, it strikes me in studying chapter 19 again that when God lies his servant down to sleep and then wakes him and gives him a cake and a jar of water, it's reminiscent, isn't it? It conjures up the incident back in chapter 17 when Elijah is told by God to go to Zarephath and there a widow will take care of him. And when he gets there, he asks the widow for a cake. And then he asks the widow for a drink. And then he promises the widow that the jar of oil will not run out in God's goodness and providence. And the same Hebrew words are used back in chapter 17, cake and jar, that are used here in chapter 19. And it seems to say to you and I, in his obedience, God provided for him back in chapter 17. And yet in his disobedience, God still cared for him here in chapter 19. God is slow to anger. God is abounding in mercy, and so God's love for his prophet here is constant and consistent. And I'm glad that is the case. It's God's character, not ours, that is the basis of his actions and reactions towards us. Aren't you thankful for that? That God's reactions and actions towards his people are based upon his own character, his own steadfast love and unfailing mercy. We saw the last time we looked at Elijah the significance of the question that God asks Elijah in chapter 19 and verse 9 and then verse 13. What are you doing here, Elijah? We were thankful to see and discover that God didn't ask the question, what are you doing there, Elijah? There would convey the idea that God is outside looking in. Here conveys the idea that God is inside alongside Elijah in his despondency. So let's look at God's treatment of this discouraged, depressed servant of his. And I think you and I can learn lessons about how we can ward off discouragement and depression in our own life. I realize that the subject is more complex than I will be able to treat in the time we have. But I think there are three things here in the text that are certainly helpful and certainly push us down the road to recovery when we find ourselves at a low point in our life or in our ministry. Now we're moving from diagnosis to prognosis. Three things. Number one, I want you to see that God dealt with Elijah physically. God refreshed his body. Physically, God refreshed his body. That's significant. Look at verse 4, 5, and 6. Elijah journeys a further day into the wilderness. He comes, he sits under a broom tree, middle of verse 4, and he prayed that he might die and said, it's enough. Now, Lord, take my life, for I am no better than my fathers. Then as he lay and slept under a broom tree, God woke him up and said, Elijah, what are you doing here? Get up, pull your socks up, right? No, that's not what the text says. The text seems to imply God let him sleep for a while, didn't he? And then suddenly, middle of verse 5, an angel touched him and said, arise and eat. And then he looked, and there by his head was a cake baked on coals and a jar of water. And so he ate and drank, and there you go again. He lay down and slept. Physically, God refreshed his body. There's little doubt that physical exhaustion played a significant role in Elijah's depression. It always does. We noted that we're in danger sometimes, and we're tempted at other times to make something profound out of depression, when in many cases it's caused by natural weariness. We get depressed, we feel low, simply when our batteries are low. That's a factor here. It's a medically tested fact that our bodies are more vulnerable to the effects of stress when our reserves of energy have been drawn down to low. Without energy reserves, the body cannot effectively fight the onslaught of stress and problems, and so exhaustion sets in, and with it comes disease and depression. And so it's vitally important that you and I take care of ourselves physically, to stay physically fit, to stay mentally alert. And God was all too aware of that. Isn't that a beautiful verse in Psalm 103, verse 14? God knows our makeup, our frame, and he remembers that we are but dust. He knows our weaknesses. He knows that we can only do so much in 12 hours or 14 hours. He wants us to rest one day a week on the Sabbath. He encourages us to take care of our bodies, to renew them and refresh them and rejuvenate them. And so we shouldn't be surprised here to find that God gives his servant 2 days bed and breakfast. Psalm 127 verse 2 says, whom God loves, he gives sleep. And so like a loving nursemaid, the angel put Elijah on bed rest coupled with a regiment of good nutrition. And here we have God pointing the way to battling with stress and overcoming distress. God here, by what he did with Elijah, points to the fact that you and I need to eat properly and we need to rest sufficiently. Some hour, as the army would put it, needs to be built into our daily regiment. The Christian must not have a Gnostic view of the body. Our bodies matter to God and they ought to matter to us. Isn't it interesting that we as evangelicals or we as fundamentalists have too often had a spongy view of the body? The same people that wouldn't dare smoke or drink, won't eat nutritionally, sleep sufficiently, or laugh loudly, which is all good for the body. And so God reminds us, you and I have a stewardship. And if we will take care of our bodies to a large degree, we will certainly be doing something to protect ourselves against the onslaught of stress and distress that can leave us in its backwash in a spirit of discouragement and depression. Let me just unpack that a little and remind you and I of what we ought to be doing, because God physically refreshed Elijah's body. 4 things I want you to think about. Number 1, take charge of your physical health. Take charge of your physical health. Dr. Richard Swenson, in his book, The Margin, says this: I have learned long ago that I can inform my patients, but not perform that which is needed in the lives of my patients. What he's saying is that every patient that comes into his office is ultimately personally responsible for their own health and well-being. They need to take charge, take care, and take control of their own bodies. And that's a biblical principle. After all, if you think about it, what does Paul tell us in his letter to the Corinthians? Your body is not your own. Therefore, if we understand that, our bodies must reflect God's ownership of them. We must be good stewards of this body, which is fearfully and wonderfully made. It's a very durable thing. It's amazing what the body can do and what it can endure if it's taken care of, if it's watched over. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, they say. Well, the road to health is paved with deliberate actions. So take charge of your own physical health. Mickey Mantle never expected to live beyond the age of 40 because his father and his grandfather both died at 40. Thinking that, Mickey Mantle abused his body with alcohol for 43 years, and when he was 62 years of age, he reflected upon his own actions, and he said this: if I'd have known I was going to live this long, I'd have taken better care of myself. I don't know how long you and I are going to live, but as long as we live, God tells us to take care of ourselves, take charge of our health. Think about our health, what we eat. Do we exercise? Do we give our bodies rest? Number 2, value and protect your sleep. Because it's significant, isn't it, that God allowed Elijah to sleep? Sometimes you and I have so much to do, we need to go to bed. It's just a fact. You cannot string yourself out across 7 days, eat on the go, not sleep well, not exercise, and expect to be on the top of your game. It just won't happen. We need to take charge of our physical health. We need to value and protect sleep. As we've said in Psalm 127, verse 2, the Bible says that God grants sleep to those he loves. Sleep's a gift. Do you understand that? Don't feel guilty about sleeping. And I realize we have all different levels. In fact, just this week when I was studying this subject, I learned that John Wesley, the great Methodist evangelist, could probably sleep on about 4 hours. And he was up at the screak of dawn about the business of the Lord's work. But the problem with John Wesley was he expected everybody else to sleep on 4 or 5 hours. And that's just not the case. We don't need to feel guilty because we sleep maybe 8 or 9 hours and somebody else can sleep 5 or 6. In fact, in the same article I read by a minister, it was noted that J.C. Ryle, the great English bishop, slept often 10 to 11 hours a night. He needed a lot of sleep. They believe there may have been some medical complications that determined that. But, here you have Wesley at 4 and 5 hours. Here you have J.C. Ryle at 10 to 11. And the doctors tell us the average man or woman needs at least 7 to 8, preferably, hours of sleep a night. Are you getting it? Are you developing healthy patterns of sleep? Do you retire at a similar time each evening and get your body into a rhythm? Have you got a quiet room where the light is shut out? Have you got a good mattress? Do you cut down on caffeine early in the evening? Do you give yourself time to unwind from the day? All those things are helpful and necessary to enjoy a good night's sleep. To sleep soundly for a full night is a valuable restorative gift. By the way, don't oversleep. The same article I read by Richard Swenson on sleep says that if you oversleep, you'll actually wake up feeling worse off rather than better. So take charge of your physical health. Value and protect your sleep. Number 3, feed your emotions. The body and soul live in such close proximity, they can catch each other's diseases, and conversely, but they can lean on each other's strengths. What I'm saying is that physical vitality can be enhanced by emotional health. A natural and God-ordained mutuality exists between physical and emotional well-being. We saw the last time we looked at this passage that God encourages Elijah to sleep. He feeds him nutritionally, and then he feeds his emotions. He gives him a new perspective. He speaks to him in a still small voice. He helps him see that all is not lost, and he lifts his spirit, and he feeds his mind, and he encourages his heart. You and I need to feed our minds and feed our hearts, because if we're mentally healthy, it will bleed over into our physical vitality. That might involve getting time with a good friend over lunch. That might involve going for a brisk walk. That might involve hobbies. That might involve laughter. In fact, regarding the last thought, what does the Bible say? A merry heart doeth good like a medicine. Relaxing. Feeding our emotions, a good book, a good conversation, a good break can do our health a great deal of wonders. That's why we often say that a change is as good as a holiday. Have some fun. Maybe do something a little crazy. Live out loud, laugh out loud, feed your emotions. I like the words of Nadine Stair at age 85. She said, if I had my life to live over, I'd like to make more mistakes next time. I'd relax. I would limber up. I would be sillier than I've been this trip. I would have fewer things to think about. I would take fewer things seriously. I would take more chances. I would climb more mountains, swim more rivers. I would eat more ice cream and fewer beans. I would perhaps have more actual trouble than imaginary ones. You see, I'm one of these people who live sensibly and sanely hour after hour, day after day. Oh, I've had my moments, and if I had to do it all over again, I'd have more of them. In fact, I'd try to have nothing else, just moments, one after another, instead of living so many years ahead of each day. I've been one of these persons who never go anywhere without a thermometer, a hot water bottle, a raincoat, and a parachute. If I had to do it all over again, I would travel later than I have. If I had my life to live over, I would start barefoot earlier in the spring, stay that way late into the fall. I would go to more dances. I would ride more merry-go-rounds. I would pick more daisies. Of course, that's an exaggeration, but I think there's food for thought there. where you and I, as we think about our physical health, we need to take charge of our physical welfare. We need to guard our sleep. We need to feed our emotions. And fourthly, we need to exercise and watch our diet. I mean, God feeds his servant here with cake and water. He takes care of Elijah nutritionally, and given the abundance of food and the opportunity to eat it, given the drag and dangers of overeating, you and I need to exercise and watch our diet. Because the fact is, our margin in physical energy shrinks as our waistline expands. We need to exercise at least 3 times a week for about 30 minutes. That might involve running, walking, swimming, anything cardiovascular. We need to find out what our ideal weight is and start a journey towards it. We need to watch our diet. We need to decrease our intake of fat. We need to decrease our intake of sugars. We need to replace processed snacks with fruit. We need to eat 3 balanced and moderate meals a day without snacking in between. We need to drink a lot of water. And we need to exercise and diet together, because dieting restricts our calories and exercise incinerates them, which is all good for us. But we need to pray that God would make us wise to the onslaught of stress and distress that can cause us to lose our passion, cause us to lose our perspective, for a time in our life make us unusable, less effective for God. And so God's practical love to Elijah here is a good reminder for us all to take care of our physical needs. God is not exclusively focused on our eternal destiny. He's also concerned about the daily management of our bodies. And so God wanted to let Elijah sleep, to get some good food in his stomach, so that he would awake and have a different perspective on things, a healthier frame of mind, a fresh perspective, so that God then could speak into his life and say, hey, Elijah, you've said it's enough, it's over. And it's not over, I've got more for you to do.
Some practical steps we can take when we're feeling down in the dumps. You're listening to Know the Truth in a study from Philip DeCourcy called Down But Not Out. I don't know about you, but I find it encouraging to realize that in many ways the heroes of the Bible were people just like you and me. They made mistakes and even faced discouragement. To help you learn more about these various characters, we have a free resource we'd like to send you. It's the Kings and Prophets Timeline pamphlet, and it's a helpful way to keep track of the many different figures in the Old Testament. Our gift to you just for getting in touch today. Go to ktt.org and look for the Kings and Prophets Timeline. We love providing Philip's daily teaching as well as other resources free of charge because we believe everyone should have access to quality Bible study resources. But we could never do it if it weren't for the support of listeners like you. When you give today, we'll say thanks with a book Philip has personally selected. It's called Courageous, 10 Strategies for Thriving in a Hostile World by Dr. Robert Jeffress. The Bible clearly teaches that we have an enemy who prowls in darkness, plotting to destroy us. So get equipped for battle with this empowering book. A copy is yours when you give a generous gift to support the ministry of Know the Truth. Just mention Courageous when you call 888-644-8811 or go online to ktt.org. If you felt your faith is under attack, if you're struggling with the temptation to follow the crowd despite biblical teaching to the contrary, or if you're just feeling weary, the 10 Strategies in Courageous will provide fresh fire and new hope. Again, call 888-644-8811 or give online at ktt.org. I'm your host, Wayne Shepherd. Join Philip DeCourcy for another encouraging message Thursday on Know the Truth. Today's program was produced and sponsored by Know the Truth Incorporated. Jesus said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free."